The millionaire stood frozen, his heart tightening at the sight before him. The little girl clutching her two younger siblings, huddled beneath a tree, surrounded by scattered clothes and baby bottles stained with mud. Their aunt, drunk and reeking of alcohol, gulped down liquor while hurling vicious insults, completely ignoring the three trembling children as they begged for mercy. That moment forced him to rush in, unveiling the horrifying truth hidden behind the gates of the mansion. Before we begin, please leave a comment about this story and give us a score from 1 to 10. Are you doing okay? If there is something you'd like to share, I am always here to listen. I hope you find a moment of reflection as you follow this healing story, along with its journey of courage and justice. The road leading to St. Mary's Orphanage was narrow and winding, lined on both sides with old oak trees. Early autumn in Atlanta carried a hint of chill, dry yellow leaves drifting in the breeze and creating a familiar rustling sound. Stephen Miller sat in his luxury car, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead. It had been 25 years since the last time he walked through those black iron gates. Yet today, the image of them was still painfully sharp in his mind. Stephen Miller, now 40 years old, was a millionaire in the media industry, chairman of a major corporation, a familiar face on the covers of many magazines. He was known as a shrewd and powerful businessman, but at this moment, all of those layers seemed to fall away. Standing before the familiar gates, he was once again the orphan boy who had been abandoned, who once dreamed of having a family that never came true. The car came to a stop, its engine softly trembling. Stephen turned it off and sat still for a long while. He looked past the rusted, stained fence. The orphanage looked almost the same, only more worn and decayed. The gloomy sky hung heavy in a thick gray tone, making the scene even more oppressive. He drew in a deep breath, opened the car door, and slowly stepped into the courtyard, walking along the familiar hallway. The smell of dampness, of rotting wood mixed with the autumn wind, pulled him back into the past. Every brick beneath his feet carried the weight of memory. The days he was punished to stand against the wall, the cold meals, and the nights he sat with his knees pulled to his chest, staring out the window, silently wishing someone would come to take him home. The director's office was at the end of the hallway. The heavy wooden door still bore the nameplate, James Carter, Director. Stephen pushed it lightly, and the door creaked open. Inside, Mr. James, now over 70, sat behind the same old, chipped wooden desk. The elderly man's back was bent, his hair completely white, glasses perched on his nose, yet his eyes, though dimmed by age, still held the sharpness that once commanded children to obey. "Excuse me, you are?" The old man's voice was slow, his gaze cautious. Stephen stopped, a sad smile appearing on his face. "My name is Stephen Miller, the boy who used to sit in the corner of the yard, quiet and stubborn. You probably don't remember." Mr. James blinked, then suddenly laughed, his voice trembling. "My goodness, Stephen? The boy I once worried no one would ever adopt? It's been so long, I thought you would never come back." Stephen stepped closer to the desk and bowed slightly in greeting. They both sat down, the long silence broken only by the ceiling fan's creaking rotation. After a while, "Mr. James asked softly, "How are you living now?" Stephen remained silent for a few seconds, then replied, "I have a career, I have a home, but I still feel something is missing. Maybe a part of my heart is still here." Mr. James nodded, his eyes distant. "I'm happy for you. Not everyone is strong enough to go that far." They spoke a little more about the orphanage, about the children who had once grown up there, until Stephen suddenly lowered his voice, his eyes filled with expectation. "Mr. James, is Anthony Brown still alive? I promised myself that one day I would come back to thank him." Mr. James's face froze. He removed his glasses and placed them on the desk, his gaze heavy with regret. After a long silence, he sighed and spoke each word slowly. "Stephen, Anthony passed away. A shipwreck off the coast of Florida, half a year ago. His wife didn't survive either. They left behind 3 young children." Stephen was stunned. The air seemed to turn solid around him. His hand clenched so tightly that his knuckles cracked. His voice trembled. No, it can't be. He was the reason I didn't give up. Without Anthony, there would be no Stephen Miller today. Memories suddenly came rushing back. He remembered clearly that sweltering afternoon at 14, when Anthony, then just in his early 20s, appeared in a white shirt, smiling broadly. He had brought pastries, a notebook, and more than anything, the words that etched themselves into Stephen's mind. You're not a bad kid. You just need a chance to prove yourself. Don't let anyone steal your future. Those very words had pulled a reckless teenager back from the edge of ruin. Stephen quickly wiped the corner of his eyes. Mr. James handed him a piece of paper, his voice sorrowful. After his death, all of Anthony and his wife's assets were transferred to the Children's Support Fund, but the 3 little ones now live with their aunt. I heard she is strict and drinks often. I worry about them. Stephen swallowed hard, then spoke through clenched teeth. Can you give me the address? I need to go there, to keep his promise for him, and to meet those children, Mr. James nodded slowly, took an old sheet of paper from the drawer, scribbled the address quickly, and handed it to Stephen. The old man's hand trembled, but his eyes were resolute. Go, Stephen. Maybe they need someone like you, just as you once needed Anthony. Stephen clenched his fist, pressing his lips together. A hot rush of blood surged inside him, mixed with pain and determination. He turned away without another word and walked slowly down the hallway. He headed quickly to his car, gripping the slip of paper with the address. The engine roared to life, blending with the sound of the wind. His eyes burned with a fire that had never gone out, the fire of memory, of gratitude, and of a promise. The car rolled forward, leaving behind a road covered with fallen leaves, heading toward the brown mansion, Anthony's home. Stephen's gaze blazed like molten steel, and in his heart, a fire burned with worry after the news from Mr. Carter. The black car glided through the gray twilight. The wind lashed against the windows, carrying the chill of a late autumn afternoon. Stephen gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes tense, his mind still echoing with the vow he had spoken at the old gates of the orphanage. He pressed gently on the gas, the straight suburban road leading him toward the Brown estate, the home that once belonged to the man who had changed his life. Stephen pictured 3 children being raised with love. Perhaps they were playing in the wide garden. Perhaps they were being cared for by family with warm food, clean clothes, and peaceful sleep. The thought eased his heart for a moment. But just as he turned into the driveway of the estate, a sound tore through the air, pulling him back into reality. Crying. Not the whining of a child throwing a tantrum. It was a strangled sob, hoarse and desperate, a sound that made Stephen shiver, his heart clenching. He immediately stopped the car, lowered the window, and strained to listen. The sound was coming from right near the front gate. Stephen opened the car door and strode quickly forward. And then he saw it. A woman swayed by the iron gate, clutching a half-empty bottle of liquor. Her hair was a tangled mess, her eyes bloodshot, her skin marked with the traces of nights drowned in alcohol. It was Betty Collins, Anthony's sister-in-law, the woman the court had appointed temporary guardian of the 3 children after their parents' death. She was supposed to be their protector, yet what Stephen witnessed was the complete opposite. Beside Betty lay a small suitcase and a bag of children's clothes, thrown carelessly onto the ground. The clothes were scattered, smeared with mud. At the foot of the large tree by the gate, a girl of about 8 sat on the ground. It was Isabella Brown, Anthony's eldest daughter. Her face was pale from the cold, her eyes swollen with tears, and her small arms were wrapped tightly around her 9-month-old twin siblings, Ethan and Emily Brown. The babies were bundled in a thin blanket damp with dew, their little bodies trembling, their cheeks flushed from the biting wind. Isabella lifted her tear-streaked face toward Betty, her voice hoarse as she begged between sobs. "Please, Aunt Betty, at least let us inside. Ethan is freezing. He's shaking all over. I beg you." Betty gave a sharp, mocking laugh, leaning against the iron gate, waving the bottle in the air as if to sneer. "You think I'm your babysitter? I don't have to carry these useless brats for the rest of my life. I've got plenty of my own problems to deal with. All you do is leech off me." Isabella choked back sobs, clutching her siblings even tighter, her broken voice trembling. "Auntie, please don't throw us out. I'll do housework. I'll clean. I'll wash clothes. I'll never bother you again. I'm just asking one thing. Please don't leave the babies out in the cold. I'm begging you." Isabella's small shoulders trembled, her reddened eyes fixed on Betty's alcohol-stained face. Ethan let out muffled sobs, while Emily whimpered weakly in her sister's arms, her breath so faint it seemed ready to fade away. Betty flung her hand dismissively, her voice dripping with scorn like a final verdict. "Shut your mouths. I am not your mother. I've suffered enough raising you for months, and what do I get in return? Nothing but burdens. One cries all day, the other two cling like leeches, and you, Isabella, I'm sick of that pitiful begging face of yours, always whispering, 'Auntie, Auntie.' It's exhausting. Your parents are dead, and they left me with 3 worthless debts. I have no obligation to sacrifice my life for any of you." As she finished speaking, she bent down and deliberately spat near Isabella's feet, her words cutting like knives. "Listen carefully, you wretched girl. If you're cold, that's your problem. I would rather raise a dog than waste space in this house on useless brats like you." Stephen froze in place. The sight of Isabella sitting on the ground, clutching her siblings, overlapped painfully with his own memories. His mother, broken and hopeless, once sat huddled in the corner of their home, crying silently as her drunken husband shouted at her. His chest tightened, as if an invisible hand were crushing his heart. He could not stand by another second. His voice rang out, firm and commanding. "Enough!" Betty flinched and spun around. Seeing Stephen in his tailored suit, his face cold as ice, she narrowed her eyes. "Who are you?" Stephen strode straight toward the tree, where the children were huddled. He gently placed his hand on Isabella's thin, trembling shoulder. Leaning down, he locked eyes with Betty, his voice low but unwavering. "These are Anthony's children, and you, what exactly are you doing to them?" Betty burst out in mocking laughter, her voice slurred with drink. "And who are you to interfere? This is my family's business, none of yours. I am their legal guardian. I have every right to decide. Don't think that just because you wear an expensive suit, you can lecture me. Get out!" Stephen clenched his hand, his entire body taut with restrained fury, but he refused to lose control. He bent down, whispering softly to Isabella, "It's all right. I'm here now." Isabella lifted her tear-streaked face. Her eyes were swollen and red, but within them flickered the faintest spark of hope. Her tiny hand clutched desperately at his sleeve, her voice trembling, "Please, don't leave." Stephen froze. That plea shattered every wall he had built around his heart. He saw himself as a boy again, sitting alone in the orphanage yard, yearning for someone, anyone, to reach out a hand. And now Isabella was staring at him with that same desperate gaze. Betty staggered forward, raising the bottle toward Stephen, her words harsh and venomous. "You think you can just reach out your hand and carry the weight of 3 brats? Just wait. They'll drag you down into the mud faster than you realize." Suddenly, Betty swung her arm hard and hurled the wine bottle straight at Stephen's chest. A piercing crash rang out as the glass shattered on the tiled floor. The thick, dark red wine spread across his gray suit jacket, running down his arm and dripping heavily onto the ground. The foul, acrid smell rose from the soaked fabric, as if hatred itself had just been spilled. Betty hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "Mind your own business. This is the price you pay for sticking your nose into someone else's family." Stephen froze. He did not lash out, nor did he shout. He only drew a deep breath, the icy wetness of the wine seeping through the fabric into his skin. Slowly, he lowered his head, slipped off the heavy jacket, folded it neatly, and placed it on the grass by his side. His movements were deliberate, yet his eyes burned with determination. His voice was low, each word cutting with clarity. "You can humiliate me, but you have no right to humiliate the children." Isabella held her breath. Her thin arms stayed wrapped around Ethan and Emily, trying to shield the little ones from the shouting. Her face was streaked with tears, her cheeks smeared with mud, yet in her trembling eyes flickered a fragile spark of hope. Stephen bent down and lifted Ethan into his arms. The boy trembled violently, his skin pale, lips purple from the cold. Stephen pressed him close to his chest, his heart aching with sorrow. Then he turned and gathered Emily with his other arm. The little girl still sucked her thumb, her eyelids drooping with exhaustion, her small body warming slowly against him. Isabella raised her face, her reddened eyes fixed on Stephen. Her voice quivered, choked with fear. "Sir, are you really going to take us away?" Stephen met her gaze, his seasoned eyes brimming with certainty. He nodded gently and spoke slowly, each word firm. "From now on, no one will ever abandon you again." Betty burst into laughter, the harsh, broken sound grating like metal scraping glass. She pointed at the jagged neck of the broken bottle still in her hand, its sharp edge glinting in the dimming light. "And who do you think you are? Just wait until the police drag you away." Stephen lifted his head, his voice heavy like forged iron. "You can call the police, you can take me to court. But tonight, I will not let these 3 children spend another minute out in the cold." Isabella stood frozen. Her small, trembling hand instinctively clutched Stephen's shirt sleeve. Mud clung to her fingers, yet he did not brush her away. Instead, he let her hold on, as if he too needed that fragile touch to remind himself of the choice he had just made. Stephen stepped forward, each stride carrying the weight of past and present. He held Ethan and Emily tightly against his chest, and with his free hand, he pulled Isabella up to her feet. The 3 children still shivered from the cold, but his steady breath surrounded them with a shield of safety and strength. From behind, Betty kept screaming, her voice hoarse and broken. "Do you think you can save them? You'll see. Those kids will only drain your strength and your money." Stephen did not turn back. He walked straight toward the car parked at the curb. With every step he took, it felt as though he was stamping an unchangeable mark onto his own life. Isabella clung tightly to him, her eyes shining with a fragile mix of hope and fear. Ethan whimpered through a soft cough, while Emily pressed her face against Stephen's chest, her little finger resting in her mouth as if she could draw warmth from his arms. Stephen opened the car door and gently placed the twins in the back seat, then carefully helped Isabella climb in beside them. He reached across to fasten the seatbelt, each movement hurried yet tender. As he closed the door, Isabella's gaze followed him without blinking, as though if she looked away even for a second, he might vanish. At the moment Stephen walked around to the driver's side, a sudden chill ran through him. On the opposite sidewalk, a lone figure stood motionless. A black hat covered most of the face, leaving only a pair of cold, sharp eyes fixed directly on them. No words, no gestures, only a silence so heavy it thickened the air. Stephen narrowed his eyes, trying to see more clearly, but just then the figure slowly turned away and disappeared behind the line of trees. He closed the driver's door, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the ignition, the engine's roar merging with the pounding of his heart. Behind him, the 3 children huddled together, their eyes filled with fear and trust. Betty's shrill screams echoed from the mansion gates, but Stephen never looked back. The tires rolled forward, carrying him and the 3 children toward a new journey, one that would test both his heart and the shadows of his past. The car slowly came to a stop in front of the towering iron gate. Stephen turned off the engine, his hand still gripping the steering wheel tightly. He sat still for a few seconds, hearing only the sound of his own heavy breathing. Through the rear-view mirror, he saw Isabella still clutching her 2 younger siblings, her face buried in their hair, her thin shoulders trembling. He opened the car door, stepped out, and walked around to the back. A cold gust of wind swept across his face, making Stephen shiver, but not because of the weather. He pulled open the back door, bent down, and gently called out, "We're here. This is your uncle's house." The 3 children did not react right away. Isabella lifted her head, her swollen eyes staring ahead. Stephen's mansion came into view, spacious, its porch lights glowing, yet so silent it felt frozen. The girl swallowed hard and whispered, "A house," with no sound at all. Stephen froze. He lowered his head and answered slowly, "Because I live alone. Please feel at home here." He was about to reach out to carry Ethan, but Isabella pulled back, holding her brother tighter. Her eyes were guarded, full of suspicion. Stephen stood motionless for a moment, then nodded gently, not pressing her further. He pushed the heavy gate open, stepped inside first, then turned back and signaled, "Come on, let's go inside." Inside, the polished wooden floor reflected the light. Stephen's shoes echoed across the vast space. He looked around. Everything was neatly arranged, spotless, without a trace of human warmth. As soon as they entered the living room, Isabella dropped onto the sofa, still clutching her siblings, as if letting go meant the world itself would snatch them away. Stephen stood awkwardly in the middle of the room. He had never seen his house look so cold. He turned quickly and headed for the kitchen. On the counter, he grabbed a can of formula he had bought long ago. His large hands clumsily turned the label, his eyes fixed on every line of the instructions. He scooped the powder, poured in hot water, steam rising thickly. His hand shook, spilling milk across the counter. Stephen muttered in a low voice, "I've never done this before, but children, trust your uncle." The sound reached Isabella's ears. She lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes watching him, and whispered softly, almost to herself, "My mom said that too." Then she left forever. Stephen froze, his hand trembling so hard the bottle nearly slipped. Her words stabbed into the wound inside him that had never healed. The image of his own mother, years ago, crying into her hands in a dark corner of the house, came flooding back. His chest tightened sharply. He stood rooted in place for a few seconds, his lips pressed firmly together. Just then, the doorbell rang. Stephen took a deep breath and hurried to open it. Standing at the door was Linda Green, a woman in her early 50s with a neat figure and gray-streaked hair tied into a bun at the back. She had been Stephen's longtime assistant, a woman known for her strictness, yet also her dedication. She looked at him, then glanced into the living room, her brows furrowing. "Sir, I just got a call about something urgent. Oh my God, what's going on here?" Stephen avoided her gaze, his voice hoarse. "Linda, I need your help. These are the children of Anthony Brown. I can't let them stay in that place another minute." Linda stepped inside, her expression shifting from surprise to shock. She saw Isabella clutching her two younger siblings tightly, her wary eyes tracking every movement. Lowering her voice, Linda walked closer, slowly and gently. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm Linda. I'm here to help. No one is going to take your siblings away from you." Isabella stayed silent, giving no reply. She only held the two children tighter, her eyes still fixed on Stephen, as if asking silently, "Can he really be trusted?" Stephen walked over, holding the bottle of milk he had just prepared, and sat down beside her. He set the bottle in front of Isabella, his voice steady but soft. "Isabella, your baby brother is crying. I'm not sure I made it right, but you can try giving it to him." Ethan whimpered in his sister's arms, his lips moving, searching for milk. Isabella looked down, then at the bottle in Stephen's hand. Her lips trembled, hesitating. At last, she slowly reached out and took it. In that moment, their eyes met. Stephen felt a sharp ache in his chest, as though an invisible thread had just reconnected. The girl no longer turned away from his gaze. For the first time, a fragile trust had begun to exist. Linda quietly tidied up the kitchen, bringing out a dry towel to wipe the spilled milk on the table. She whispered softly when Stephen stood up, "Sir, do you realize what this means? This isn't something temporary. This is for a lifetime." Stephen looked at the three children, his voice deep and firm. "I know, and I've already made my choice." That night, the once silent house echoed for the first time with the sounds of children. A baby's loud cries, awkward words of comfort, Isabella's soft whispers as she rocked her siblings to sleep. Stephen lay on the long couch in the living room, eyes wide open, his ears straining to catch every little sound. Everything felt so new, so fragile. He only dared to close his eyes for brief moments, his heart still heavy with worry. In the dark, Isabella's voice rose, small but clear, piercing through the night like a needle. "You're going to leave us too, just like everyone else, aren't you?" Stephen's eyes flew open. He turned, seeing the girl still holding her siblings tightly, her wide eyes fixed on him. The question hung in the air, heavy as a stone sinking into still water. Stephen held his breath, his heart pounding, knowing this was not just a child's question. It was the final test to unlock a trust that had been sealed away for far too long. Stephen sat up abruptly, his eyes locking with Isabella's fragile gaze. He had not yet spoken, and the room was already thick with silence, as if the entire space was waiting to see whether he truly had the strength to keep his promise both to his past and to these 3 children. Stephen sat up on the couch, his arms numb after a sleepless night. Isabella's question kept pounding in his head like the relentless strike of a hammer. "Are you going to abandon us, just like everyone else did?" He hadn't answered, because when he looked over, he saw the little girl had already fallen asleep from exhaustion. Her thin arms were still clutching her 2 younger siblings tightly, as if letting go for even a moment would cause everything to disappear. The sight pierced Stephen's heart. He knew that feeling all too well, the fear of losing the only thing left. In the stillness of the night, old memories returned. He saw himself at 8 years old, curled up in a suffocating house reeking of alcohol, hearing the door slam when his father walked out without a goodbye. He saw his mother, a gentle woman, sitting silently in the corner with empty eyes. And then, one winter morning, she was gone, leaving Stephen completely alone. He covered his face with his hands. Cold sweat trickled down even though the room wasn't warm. In his mind, a voice rang out clearly, "I can't let this cycle continue." Morning filtered through the window, golden sunlight spreading across the polished wooden floor. Stephen sat at the dining table, a cup of coffee in front of him, long gone cold. He glanced toward the living room. Isabella sat there, her back straight and rigid, her arms locked tightly around Ethan and Emily. She looked like a little soldier, determined not to abandon her post. Ethan and Emily stirred awake, shifting in their sister's arms. Isabella quickly pulled the old blanket over them, hiding their tiny legs. But in that brief moment, Stephen saw it clearly. Isabella's socks were worn through, her toes poking out, stained with the mud from the night before. The girl hurried to cover them, her face flushing red with shame. Stephen said nothing. He simply stood up. He went into his room, opened the wardrobe, and searched inside. In the corner, he found a small box with a few things he had never used, gifts from holidays long ago. He pulled out a brand new pair of wool socks, ash gray in color, and walked back. Setting them gently on the table in front of Isabella, Stephen spoke in a calm voice. "Try these on and see if they fit." Isabella looked up, her eyes wide. She touched the socks lightly and asked in a trembling voice, "Do I have to give them back to you?" Stephen knelt down so his eyes were level with hers. His voice was deep and steady, yet warm. "They're yours. When a parent gives a gift to their child, they never ask for it back." Isabella froze. She didn't cry, and she didn't smile. She only looked at Stephen for a long time, as though, in that instant, an invisible door had quietly opened. Meanwhile, at the Brown mansion, Betty Collins collapsed onto the couch. Her face was gaunt, her hair disheveled. The table in front of her was covered with papers and half-empty bottles of liquor. Facing her was a middle-aged man in a finely tailored black suit. His hair was slicked back, his eyes cold as steel. That was Michael Harris, a well-known lawyer in Atlanta, a man who had helped more than a few people turn situations around using both legitimate and questionable tactics. Michael closed the file slightly, his voice calm. "State your intentions clearly. I don't make a habit of wasting time." Betty clenched her teeth, slammed her hand on the table, making the wine glass ripple. "I will not lose that money. Those 3 children are my ticket. If that Stephen dares to take them, I'll be left with nothing." Michael smirked, replying with ease. "Calm down. The law is something that can be bent, if you know how. On paper, you are still their temporary guardian. We will file a petition to dispute custody. If we win, the assets go back to you." Betty narrowed her eyes, her voice hissing through her teeth. "Do it. I don't care what method you use. I just want those kids back. And I want that millionaire to learn that if he dares interfere in my affairs, he will pay for it." Michael nodded slowly, pulling a stack of papers from his briefcase. "Then let's begin." That afternoon in his office, Stephen sat in front of the computer screen. He was about to work on a few unfinished documents when his email inbox lit up. A new message appeared, and the subject line froze him in place. "Notice of lawsuit, custody dispute. Collins versus Miller." He opened it. Each word struck his eyes like ice. Betty Collins had officially filed a petition to dispute custody of the 3 children. A preliminary hearing would be held in the near future. Stephen leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. Outside, Emily's laughter rang bright and clear. Ethan babbled as he practiced his first words. Isabella soothed him, her voice hoarse but gentle. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Inside, a weight pressed heavily, yet beneath it rose a firm resolve. He knew without doubt the real battle had begun. Stephen opened his eyes, their light fierce. He clenched his fists, whispering to himself, "Anthony, I will not let your legacy fall into someone else's hands. Even in court, I will stand firm for these children." That morning, the city of Atlanta was covered in a thin veil of mist. Stephen held Isabella's hand as they walked down the long courthouse hallway, the sound of his shoes striking evenly but heavily against the floor. His grip on the stack of documents was so tight that his fingers had turned white. Each step felt like stepping into a battle he was destined to lose. Beside him was David Thompson, a 45-year-old attorney with a strong build and neatly cropped gray hair. He had once been a prosecutor before becoming an independent lawyer, known for his integrity and sharp debating skills. David glanced at Stephen, his voice low and steady. "Stay calm. The truth will speak for itself. I'm here to protect you and the children." Isabella walked close, her small hand clutching Stephen's coat tightly without letting go for even a second. Her wide eyes were filled with worry, yet there was still a fragile glimmer of hope. Behind them, Linda Green carried the twins, trying to soothe them to sleep as she waited in the back row reserved for temporary guardians. The doors of the courtroom opened. Inside, wooden benches were filled to the brim. The crowd pressed together, a wave of whispers and murmurs rolling across the room. The light from the windows slanted down, thickening the tense atmosphere. As Stephen took a deep breath, he walked straight to the defendant's table. Across from him, Betty Collins was already seated. She wore a dark fur coat, her face heavily made up to hide her gaunt features. Her eyes were bloodshot, burning with hostility. Next to her sat Michael Harris, her attorney, dressed in a polished black suit, his cold face marked by a faint, arrogant smile. The sound of the gavel struck 3 times. Judge Scott, a man in his early 50s, tall and lean with a stern face, ascended to the bench. His voice rang out loud and clear. "The custody hearing between Collins and Miller is now in session." Michael was the first to stand. He picked up a file of papers, stepped to the center of the room, and spoke in a firm, deliberate tone. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Betty Collins, is the biological aunt and the legal guardian of these 3 children after the tragic death of their parents. However, Mr. Stephen Miller, who has no blood relation whatsoever, took the children without court authorization. This is abduction disguised as kindness. He has exploited the children's vulnerability to gradually seize control of the family's assets." A buzz of whispers rippled through the courtroom. Dozens of eyes turned towards Stephen, his fists clenched, hot blood rushing to his face. Stephen suddenly rose, his voice resounding, hoarse yet unshakable. "Abduction? I saw with my own eyes when she threw their belongings out into the street. I saw Isabella clutching her siblings under a tree, soaked and shivering. She called them a burden, treated them like garbage. And that is what she calls guardianship?" Betty slammed the table and jumped to her feet, screaming, her voice harsh and broken. "I am their aunt. Who has more right than me? You've only known them for a few days. Don't fool yourself into thinking you are their father." Judge Scott pounded his gavel forcefully, his tone sharp. "Order. If this happens again, I will have you removed from the courtroom." David Thompson stood, his voice calm but cutting like steel. "Your Honor, we have a witness." The back door opened. A middle-aged woman stepped in, thin and frail, her graying hair tied neatly. She clutched her handbag tightly, her steps trembling. It was Sandra Lewis, a former neighbor of the Brown family. She walked to the witness stand, her voice shaky but clear. "I often heard children crying through the night. One time I went outside and saw Mrs. Collins throwing suitcases, even the children's toys, out into the yard. The 3 kids sat by the gate for hours, and no one opened the door for them." Betty's face turned pale, her voice shrill as she screamed, "You're lying. You've always been jealous of me. Sandra's eyes filled with tears, her voice choking. "I wish I had called the police sooner, but I swear to this court, everything I've said is true." The courtroom erupted in shock. Dozens of angry eyes turned toward Betty. Michael Harris sat still, but his fingers tightened around his pen, his face growing tense. In that charged silence, Isabella suddenly burst into tears. She jumped from her seat and ran to Stephen at the witness stand, wrapping her arms around him as her broken voice echoed across the room. "I want to stay with you. You didn't leave us out in the rain. You're not like the others." The entire courtroom fell silent. Isabella's sobs tore through the heavy atmosphere. Stephen bent down, holding her close, his eyes red with emotion. He whispered, his voice low and trembling, "I promise, I will never abandon you." Judge Scott sat in silence for a few moments, his gaze heavy. Then he struck his gavel 3 times, his voice firm. After hearing the witness and reviewing the circumstances, while awaiting further investigation, temporary custody will be granted to Mr. Stephen Miller. The courtroom stirred with murmurs. Linda clutched the twins tightly, her eyes glistening. Isabella sobbed in Stephen's arms, smiling through her tears for the very first time. But Betty was different. She sprang to her feet, her face twisted with rage, her hands trembling violently. She glared at Stephen, hissing through her teeth, "I will not let this go. You will regret this." Michael Harris placed a hand on Betty's shoulder, forcing her back down, yet his gaze never left Stephen. His eyes were cold and cutting, silent but clear enough to signal a long and bitter battle ahead. As Stephen led Isabella out of the courtroom, he glanced back for a moment. Behind him, Michael Harris was staring fixedly, his eyes flashing with a wordless warning. The battle has only just begun. The bar on the outskirts of Atlanta was sunk in dim yellow lights and heavy cigarette smoke. Old, worn-out jazz tunes dragged on, echoing the mood of the lost souls inside. Betty Collins sat alone in a corner, her hand trembling as she set her glass of liquor down. Her skin was gaunt, her smudged makeup unable to hide her exhaustion. The memory of that morning's trial still burned in her mind like fire. She had lost, temporarily stripped of custody, and worst of all, stripped of control over the enormous fortune she believed should have been hers. "It looks like you've had a terrible day, Betty." A deep, raspy male voice, brimming with confidence, came from her side. Betty looked up. A man in his 40s stood there, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, tie loosened, hair slicked back with a polished shine. His eyes gleamed sharp and cunning. He extended his hand. "I'm Victor Reed. People say I know how to turn failure into opportunity." Next to Victor stood a young woman with flowing red hair, bold lipstick, and mischievous green eyes. She smiled faintly and raised her cocktail glass. "Karen O'Neill. Victor and I usually show up right when people need a way out." Betty smirked, her hoarse voice low. "You two planning to preach to me? I don't need pity." Victor chuckled, pulling a thick stack of documents from his briefcase and laying it on the table. His finger tapped lightly, rhythmically, against the folder. "No, not pity. This is a golden opportunity. You're thirsty for money, and I have an investment channel. All you need to do is sign this, and the children's inheritance becomes capital. I guarantee in a few months, you'll double it. Then when you go back to court, you'll be stronger than anyone else." Betty straightened up, her dull eyes suddenly lighting with a dangerous spark. The thought of humiliation at Stephen's hands burned hot in her mind, mixing with her craving for power. She whispered, almost delirious, "I will take it all back, and more." Karen leaned closer, her voice smooth as honey. "Trust me, Betty. Life doesn't hand out many chances. Either you grab it, or you get left behind." Betty stared at the stack of papers, her heartbeat pounding wildly. Her hands shook as she reached for the pen. The liquor in her glass rippled, the reflected light dancing mockingly. But she signed anyway. Meanwhile, in another world, something was slowly being mended. Stephen Miller, once a reclusive millionaire, was now learning to be a father day by day. The next morning, he took the 3 children to the pediatric clinic. Ethan wailed when the doctor gave him a shot, while Emily clung tightly to Stephen's finger, refusing to let go. Flustered, sweat forming on his forehead, Stephen still tried to keep his voice steady. "It's okay, I'm right here. It'll be over in a second." The doctor glanced at him and nodded slightly. You did well. Children sense more than we think. If you panic, they will be even more afraid. Isabella sat nearby, her eyes following him silently. But in that gaze flickered a trace of surprise. Perhaps she had not expected this man to truly be so patient. That afternoon, Stephen took all 3 children to the park. The late sunlight spilled across the grass. Ethan tried a few wobbly steps, tumbled forward, and burst into tears. Stephen immediately bent down, reached out to steady him, and gave a clumsy smile. Good job now. Try again. Emily crawled around, clutching handfuls of grass, babbling sounds that were not yet clear. Stephen laughed out loud, a sound he himself had not heard from his own mouth in a long time. Isabella stood farther away, arms crossed, cautious in posture, but her lips curved faintly as she watched the 2 little ones laugh in that man's arms. When night came, Stephen spread blankets in the living room and read children's books to all 3. The twins quickly drifted to sleep, leaving only Isabella sitting there, her large round eyes glowing with inner struggle. After a long silence, she whispered, "If you really want, I could call you Daddy." Stephen froze. He closed the book and looked at Isabella for a long time. In the girl's eyes was anticipation mixed with worry, as if she feared rejection. He pulled her close, held her tightly against his chest, and said in a trembling voice, "You don't need to rush, but I will never abandon you." Isabella closed her eyes, letting herself lean into someone's embrace for the very first time. Meanwhile, across the city, Betty sat in a luxurious hotel, a glass of red wine swirling in her hand. Victor and Karen stood behind her, eyes filled with satisfaction. On the laptop screen, numbers of a newly transferred account appeared. Betty burst into loud laughter, wine and triumph blending together. "In just a few weeks, Stephen Miller will be on his knees before me," she shouted, her laughter cracking. But weeks later, when she checked again, the cold bank message appeared. "Account does not exist." Betty's face went pale. She frantically dialed Victor's number. The line was unreachable. Karen had vanished. The hotel room left completely empty. Everything had evaporated. She collapsed to the floor, her hands trembling violently, her mouth stammering. No, this can't be. It can't be." The wine glass shattered, shards of glass scattering everywhere. Betty screamed, her hair disheveled, her eyes bloodshot like a beast cornered with no way out. While Stephen gently tucked a blanket over Isabella and softly stroked her hair, somewhere else Betty pounded her fists against the floor, her voice hoarse as she shrieked, "I will drag those kids back. Do you hear me? I swear I won't let this rest." In the morning, pale sunlight streamed through the large window. Stephen was in the kitchen, awkwardly stirring porridge for Ethan and Emily. At the table, Isabella sat quietly, her small hands carefully cutting fruit the way Linda had once taught her. Everything looked strangely peaceful, yet inside Stephen still carried a constant worry. What would happen at the upcoming trial? Would he have enough strength to keep the children with him? A sudden knock pounded on the door, firm and decisive. Stephen wiped his hands and quickly walked over to open it. Standing on the porch was a tall man with a stern face, wearing a dark leather jacket. He looked about 50, with graying hair and serious eyes that were not unkind. The nameplate on his chest read clearly, "Detective Mark Wilson." "Mr. Miller?" His voice was deep and steady. "Yes, that's me," Stephen replied, tension flickering across his face. Mark opened a black case and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "We have just completed the investigation into the Brown family inheritance account. Mrs. Collins withdrew funds without authorization. Not only that, there are traces of forged signatures, and everything points to attorney Michael Harris." Stephen took the folder. His eyes froze on the sloppy signatures, his voice hoarse with anger. "I knew it. She never cared about the children. To her, they were nothing more than a ticket to money." From the kitchen door, Isabella peeked out, clutching her 2 younger siblings tightly. Her wide eyes were full of worry. Stephen bent down, placed his hand on her hair, and gently reassured her. "It's all right, sweetheart. Everything will be made clear soon." A few days later, the supplementary hearing was held. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension. Stephen sat in the defendant's row, with David Thompson, his attorney, beside him, sharp-eyed and composed. Isabella sat behind, still clutching Stephen's coat as if letting go meant losing him all over again. Judge Scott struck his gavel, his voice loud and firm. The supplementary hearing regarding the custody dispute is now in session. David rose, his tone calm. Your Honor, we have additional witnesses and evidence. The door opened, and Sandra Lewis walked in. She wore an old dress, carrying a clear plastic box in her hands. Her steps were trembling, but her gaze was steady. Your Honor, Sandra's voice broke, these are items I picked up from the trash near Mrs. Collins's house. Isabella's dress, Ethan's toy car, some of Emily's books. I even heard her say, they're just garbage, throw them away. No one would buy them anyway. I stayed silent for too long, but now I cannot close my eyes anymore. The courtroom stirred with whispers. Many shook their heads and sighed. Their eyes turned toward Betty, who sat pale and stiff at the plaintiff's table. Betty slammed her hand on the table, her voice shrill. Lies! Every word is a lie! She envies me. That's why she's slandering me. Tears welled in Sandra's eyes as she turned to the judge. I will accept any consequences if I am wrong, but I swear I saw it with my own eyes. The judge nodded, then turned to the plaintiff. Attorney Michael Harris, please step forward. Michael Harris stood up. His face was tense, his hand gripping the pen tightly. He walked slowly to the witness stand. The court clerk handed a stack of papers to the judge. Scott flipped through each page, his eyes stern. We had the signatures on the withdrawal records examined. The results show that this is not Anthony Brown's signature. It is yours, Michael Harris. Do you have anything to say about this? The entire courtroom fell silent. Michael's face turned pale, sweat forming on his temples. He opened his mouth, stammering, I only wanted to help the process go faster. Scott banged the gavel hard, cutting him off. Help? You forged documents and interfered with inherited property. This is a serious violation. Betty gasped, turned to Michael and shouted, You promised me. You told me I would win. Why is everything falling on me now? Michael lowered his head, saying nothing. Stephen sat still, his hands clenched so tightly they trembled. He looked at Isabella, seeing her eyes brimming with tears, but in them flickered a spark of hope. After a few tense minutes, Judge Scott announced, After reviewing the evidence and testimony, the court hereby orders all of Mrs. Betty Collins's assets frozen pending investigation. Attorney Michael Harris is suspended from practicing law effective immediately, awaiting further inquiry into his forgery. The gavel struck 3 times. The courtroom buzzed, then fell into dead silence. From the back row, Linda exhaled in relief and gently held Isabella's hand. The girl was still trembling, but for the first time her shoulders eased. Betty slumped over the table, her makeup smeared, her hair disheveled. Her eyes were lost, her lips muttering emptily, No, this can't be. Give me wine. I need wine. Stephen looked at the scene, his heart heavy. There was no satisfaction in him. He only saw a woman destroying herself with greed, with alcohol, with the inability to cherish what was truly valuable. He closed his eyes, recalling Anthony's words years ago, Don't let anyone steal your future. And now, he understood, his responsibility was to protect the future of the 3 children sitting behind him. As Stephen carried Ethan out of the courthouse, Isabella held his hand tightly, refusing to let go. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. But from a distant corner, another pair of eyes was watching, cold and sharp. Victor Reed and Karen O'Neill were still in the shadows, far from gone. That night, rain poured endlessly over the city of Atlanta. Each drop struck the window glass, blending with the sound of distant thunder, as if determined to drown the entire city in darkness. Inside Stephen's house, a warm yellow light glowed from the living room, where he had just lulled Ethan and Emily to sleep. Isabella curled up on the sofa, a children's book lying half open on her lap, her eyelids heavy with fatigue. A knock came at the door. At first, just a few hurried taps, then pounding, urgent and insistent. Stephen frowned slightly, stood up and walked quickly to the porch, his heart tightening with a sudden sense of foreboding. When the door swung open, the sight before him made him freeze. Betty Collins stood there. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes soaked through with rain, her makeup smeared, her high heels caked in mud. She trembled like a fragile leaf, her bloodshot eyes filled with despair. In her hand she clutched an empty glass that had shattered, a small cut on her finger bleeding into the rainwater. She said nothing, only stared at him. Then, as if all strength had left her, Betty collapsed, her knees hitting the cold tile floor with a dull thud. "Stephen," her voice was hoarse, choked with tears. I was wrong. Please, give me a chance. At least let me see the children, just once." Stephen stood motionless. Rain lashed against him, soaking his shirt, but he didn't notice. His heart surged with conflicting emotions. He clenched his jaw, his eyes sharp and cold. "You already had your chance. The chance to be their aunt, the chance to be their support. But you chose alcohol. You chose money. You chose yourself. That day, under the tree, you left them trembling in the rain. Do you remember?" Betty broke into sobs, her cries mingling with the storm. She reached out like a drowning person grasping for a lifeline. "I've lost everything. Victor deceived me. Karen disappeared. The money, the house, it's all gone. The only thing I have left are the children. Please don't take away this last hope." Stephen looked at the woman before him. Under the weak glow of the street lamp, Betty's face no longer carried arrogance, only ruin, twisted by greed and despair. In that moment, memories surged. He saw his own mother years ago, collapsed in the corner of their home, her eyes empty after life had crushed her spirit. He closed his eyes. His chest tightened. Inside, his thoughts screamed, "She doesn't deserve it. She hurt the children. But if I turn my back now, am I any different from my father, who abandoned my mother back then?" Opening his eyes, Stephen spoke slowly, his voice low and steady. "You will never again have the chance to hurt the children, but I also cannot let you drown in alcohol and hatred." Betty lifted her head, her eyes glistening with tears, caught between joy and confusion. Stephen turned back toward the house and called out loudly, "Linda!" Linda Green, the woman who had stood by his side for so many years, stepped out, wearing a cardigan. She saw Betty, her eyes showing a brief flicker of surprise, but no real shock. "Find her a temporary place to stay, and get her a simple job, cleaning, janitorial work, anything that lets her survive," Stephen instructed, his voice steady, without hatred, yet without excessive pity either. Linda nodded without asking further. She helped Betty to her feet. Betty staggered, leaning against Linda's shoulder, her breath heavy with the smell of alcohol. Yet in her eyes there seemed to be a faint glimmer of light again. Stephen stood on the porch, quietly watching. When he returned to the living room, he saw Isabella standing in the doorway, her gaze steady and silent. The girl was dressed in loose pajamas, her hair falling freely, her young face etched with worry far beyond her age. "Uncle," she spoke in a trembling voice, "why did you still help Aunt Betty after everything she did to us?" Stephen froze. He wanted to answer immediately, but his throat tightened. In his mind, the image of his own mother appeared once more, her frail body hunched in a dark corner, crying. He remembered his helplessness back then, and he remembered Anthony, the man who had reached out to him at the orphanage. He bent down, placing a hand on Isabella's shoulder. His voice was deep, raspy, yet clear. "There are people who need a hand to pull them back up, even when they no longer deserve it. That does not erase their mistakes, but it prevents the cruel cycle from repeating. I do not want you or your siblings to grow up one day, see someone fall, and simply turn away." Isabella stayed silent, her lips pressed tight. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she gave a slight nod, not because she fully understood, but because for the first time she saw an adult truly face pain instead of avoiding it. Stephen pulled her into his arms, holding her gently. He knew that what he had done today would plant a different kind of lesson in Isabella's heart, a lesson about humanity, even when facing those who once caused you harm. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, Stephen sat alone in the living room. Outside, the rain still poured down, the wind whistling softly. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. An anonymous message appeared on the screen, the words chilling, "Do not think you have won, there are still debts waiting." V. Stephen narrowed his eyes. His hand tightened around the phone. A dark premonition rose within him. Victor Reed had not disappeared. He lifted his gaze toward the window. A flash of lightning illuminated his resolute face. Somewhere across the city, someone was still weaving their net, and Stephen knew the battle was far from over. Spring arrived in Atlanta with clear mornings. Gentle sunlight filtered through young leaves and lingered on the courthouse steps. Stephen walked slowly, his hand gripping the case files so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded, yet his gaze no longer carried the same heaviness as before. Beside him, David Thompson, his loyal attorney, gave a quiet nod of reassurance. Behind them, Isabella clutched the hem of Stephen's coat as if it were the only thread connecting her to the world. Ethan and Emily were carried by Linda, their wide eyes darting around, too young to understand what was about to unfold. The courtroom glowed with natural light, every wooden bench filled. The air was tense, yet full of expectation. After so many months of turmoil, everything was about to reach its conclusion. Judge Scott, his face stern, yet his eyes holding a trace of kindness, read from the thick stack of conclusions. He struck the gavel 3 times, his voice ringing out clear and firm. After considering all the evidence, witness testimonies, and the children's wishes, the court hereby rules: permanent custody of Isabella Brown, Ethan Brown, and Emily Brown is granted to Mr. Stephen Miller. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room like a hammer straight into Stephen's chest. He closed his eyes, drew a deep breath, and felt Isabella's tiny hand squeezing his harder than ever before. Murmurs rose in the room, then turned into scattered but heartfelt applause. Isabella buried her face into Stephen's shoulder, her voice trembling with emotion. "Will we really get to stay with you?" Stephen held her tightly, his eyes blurred with tears. "Not just stay with me. From now on, we are a family." A few days later, Stephen's mansion, once haunted by cold silence, was now filled with laughter. A small party was held, not extravagant, only cakes, balloons, and hearts brimming with joy. Linda busied herself setting the table and hanging bright ribbons. Stephen clumsily tried to help, his hands more used to signing contracts and holding pens now fumbling with tiny bows. On their high chairs, Ethan and Emily giggled and babbled. When Stephen leaned down to kiss their foreheads, both cried out together. "Da, da, da, da!" The sound made the entire room fall still for a moment. Stephen froze, his eyes welling up. For the first time in his life, he heard himself called Daddy. A single word, short and simple, yet it carried the whole world he had always longed for. He hugged the 2 children tightly, his voice breaking. "Daddy is here, and Daddy will always be here." At the corner of the table, Isabella wore a pale blue dress that Linda had sewn from an old one. Her hair was neatly combed, her face glowing. When everyone sang the birthday song, Isabella leaned down to blow out the candles with her 2 siblings, then turned to Stephen, her eyes sparkling. She smiled softly and whispered, "I'm not afraid of being left behind anymore, Daddy." Stephen fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around all 3 of them, tears streaming down his face uncontrollably. "From now on, no one can ever take you away from me. No one." Linda turned her face away, quietly wiping the corner of her eyes. She knew that the cold man she once met had finally found the family he truly deserved. That night, when the children were sound asleep, Stephen opened the old wooden cabinet and took out something he had always kept. It was a small notebook with a worn leather cover, its yellowed pages carrying the weight of time. On the first page was a familiar handwriting, "Faith can save an entire life." Stephen held it in his hands for a long while, then walked into Isabella's room. The girl was still awake, sitting by the headboard hugging her old teddy bear. "Isabella." Stephen sat down and handed her the notebook. "Long ago, your father, Anthony, gave this to me. He said, 'Don't let anyone steal your future.' Because of this, I was able to stand tall and make it to today. Now, I want to pass it on to you." Isabella's hands trembled as she opened the notebook. Her eyes moved across each line, as if she were holding on to a piece of her father. She looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Daddy, I'll keep it. I promise." Stephen nodded gently and pulled her into his arms. In that embrace, he felt something he once thought was out of reach, A true connection. The next morning, the house was filled with sunlight. Laughter echoed everywhere. Ethan was learning to walk, taking small wobbly steps on the wooden floor, falling then standing up again in Stephen's arms. Emily babbled at her brother, clapping with delight. Isabella ran around, her pure laughter ringing throughout the home for the very first time. Stephen stood in the middle of the room, watching the three children as if he were seeing his own childhood being healed. He whispered to himself, "Anthony, you gave me this family. I will protect them with my life." His gaze lingered on the photo hanging on the wall, a picture of Anthony and his wife smiling radiantly. Under the morning light, Anthony's face seemed to smile kindly, blessing everything Stephen now had. Stephen lifted his head and murmured, "I'll continue your path, but this time I won't walk it alone." Outside the window, night slowly descended. In the shadows, a strange car stopped at the corner of the street. Inside, a pair of cold eyes gleamed. Victor Reed had not disappeared. Stephen and his family's new journey would face many more trials, but this time he was no longer alone. Today's story has come to an end, but its echo will surely remain in each of our hearts. A man who once endured a childhood filled with loss found the courage to rise, opening his arms to protect innocent children. From that very moment, the fate of all three children was changed forever. The message this story conveys is crystal clear. No matter how cunning or deceitful, wrongdoers will eventually pay the price. Meanwhile, good people, those who live with compassion, will surely be rewarded. Above all, love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, restoring faith and hope to humanity. My dear friends, as you follow these heartwarming stories, these touching stories from Story for Heart, I believe each of you will find a moment for reflection. What would you do if you were Stephen? Would you have the courage to step up and protect those children? And if you were Isabella, would you have enough faith to call someone daddy again? I truly care about your feelings. Please share with me in the comments. What does this story remind you of in your own life? And what are you hoping for in the upcoming episodes on this channel? Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories from Story for Heart. I am always here, listening and walking alongside you. A millionaire had just stepped through the gate and froze in shock at what he saw. His 6-year-old daughter, her golden brown hair being yanked and hacked at by her stepmother, tears streaming down her cheeks like rain as she sobbed and pleaded, "Mom, please don't cut my hair." In that very instant, he rushed forward and shouted a single sentence that left everyone stunned and speechless. And what happened next, no one could have expected. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's begin the story. The sharp sound of shattering glass rang out through the spacious mansion in the suburbs of Scarsdale. Alice Miller, 6 years old, froze in fear as she saw the broken shards scattered across the floor, water splashing onto the corner of Becky's red dress. Becky was the woman her millionaire father had married less than a year ago. Alice stammered, "I'm sorry," but before she could finish, her thin little arm was yanked back harshly. Becky Miller, 35, slender with sharp eyes, bold red lips, and neatly styled curls, erupted in fury. Her shrill voice echoed through the grand hall. "Useless!" Becky screamed, her pitch so high it made Alice shrink. "You can't even wipe a table without breaking a glass. You're nothing but a burden in this house. All you ever do is make a mess." Alice was dragged toward the front door, her small hands flailing helplessly. Her blue and white dress was wrinkled, her brownish blonde hair tangled. The child tried to speak, her voice weak and trembling. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to. I'll clean it up. I'll do better." "Sorry?" Becky curled her lip, gripping Alice's wrist tighter. "Do you think an apology will make this dress dry itself? You ruined my outfit, so you'll be punished. Punished, so you'll never forget. Do you understand me, you worthless girl?" She pulled Alice outside, ignoring the child's feeble resistance. In her rage, Becky shoved Alice down on the stone steps. One hand pressed the little girl's shoulder, the other grabbed a pair of scissors left on a flower pot nearby. The cold metallic clang sent a chill through the air. Alice panicked, tears streaming down her cheeks, her whole body trembling. She clutched her dress tightly, unable to reach for the worn brown teddy bear in her room, the last gift her real mother had given her before she passed away. That bear had always been her comfort, but now it was out of reach. Alice sat defenseless in front of Becky's wrath. Becky's voice lashed like a whip. "It's time you learned a lesson you'll never forget. A rich man's daughter, filthy and careless like this, you're nothing but a disgrace." The scissors scraped against her hair, catching the light. A soft lock of brownish blonde hair fell onto the stone steps. Alice broke down, screaming, her voice cracking apart. "Mom, please don't cut my hair. I'll be good, I promise, I promise." The sound of a child's cries carried out into the street. A few neighbors walking their dogs stopped in their tracks. Some stood at a distance, whispering. One woman shook her head in pity. A man murmured, "That poor girl." Alice could see every look, could feel the heavy silence, yet no one stepped forward. Becky grew harsher by the second. She yanked Alice's hair hard, dragging the scissors across for another cut. Strands fell to the ground, mixing with tears. Alice faltered, clutching her dress tighter, her reddened eyes fixed on the floor. She felt as if she was losing the last thing that kept her whole. Her hair, a keepsake, a memory of her mother, was being chopped away piece by piece. Her small hands gripped the hem of her dress, lips trembling as she repeated her hopeless pleas. It felt as though the entire world had turned its back, leaving her with no one to protect her. Just then, the dry screech of brakes echoed from the gate. A sleek black Bugatti Chiron stopped right at the entrance. The sharp click of the car door opening cut through the air. Becky flinched, her hand holding the scissors frozen in place. A tall man in a brown suit stepped out. His dark hair, streaked with silver, framed eyes cold as steel. In his left hand he carried a leather file bag he had not yet put away. In his right, a green stuffed dinosaur, the gift he had just bought on his business trip. The child kept sobbing. Becky had not even hidden the scissors when the man's eyes locked onto the scene before him. He stood stunned for a few seconds, his face darkening. His breath came heavy, his grip tightening around the green dinosaur. The air seemed to freeze. The neighbors fell silent. The only sound left was Alice's muffled sobs. The man strode into the yard, his shadow stretching across the steps. His deep, hoarse voice broke out, cold and cutting. "Becky, what do you think you're doing?" That man was Richard Miller, 40 years old, a millionaire, a successful tech entrepreneur, a widower who had lost his wife in a tragic accident when Alice was only 2 years old, now standing frozen in the middle of his own yard. He was not only known as a cold millionaire, people also knew him as someone who buried himself in work to escape the pain of the past. Today, he had returned from a long business trip, still carrying in his hand a blue stuffed dinosaur he had bought for his daughter. But the scene in front of him turned that gift into something far too small compared to the horror unfolding before his eyes. He looked at his daughter, her hair chopped unevenly, her eyes red and wet with tears, her little hands gripping the hem of her blue and white dress. The light brown hair that had once been Alice's small pride, a tender reminder of her late mother, now fell in clumps at her feet. Richard went numb. His eyes hardened, his breath came short, his throat tightened, yet his voice still broke out, low and hoarse, each word pressed out with force. "Becky, what is going on here?" Becky flinched. The face that just moments before was tight with tension suddenly changed so quickly it was almost unbelievable. In an instant, the anger and harshness disappeared, replaced by a frail posture and eyes shimmering as if she were about to cry. Her voice trembled, straining to calm the moment. "Richard, it's not what you think. I was just trying to teach her a little. The girl, she's so stubborn, she doesn't listen. I never meant any harm. I just wanted her to learn to correct her mistakes." Richard dropped the briefcase heavily to the ground, still holding the blue dinosaur in his right hand. He walked straight to Alice, bent down, and pulled her into his arms. The small body trembled, and a choking sob broke against his ear. "Daddy, I'm scared." That cry pierced into his heart like a knife. In that single instant, all the years Richard had convinced himself that remarrying would bring warmth to his daughter collapsed. He held her tight, his hand gently patting Alice's back, his eyes never leaving Becky. Becky's gaze darted around, as though hoping someone might step forward to defend her. But what she met instead was only a look of suspicion from across the street. Linda Green, the gray-haired neighbor, stood silently by the gate, her face etched with discomfort. She gave a slight shake of her head, her lips pressed tight, as if she wanted to speak but held herself back. Becky turned toward Richard, her voice raised slightly, tinged with worry. "Richard, can't you see? I only wanted the girl to understand manners. I never meant to hurt her. Truly, I didn't. You came back so suddenly. Of course, you haven't seen the whole picture." Richard held Alice tighter, the green dinosaur toy trapped between father and daughter. He didn't shout, but every word carried a chilling weight. "I've seen enough." Alice looked up, tears still rolling down her cheeks, and buried her face against her father's shoulder. Becky stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch Richard's arm. "Richard, I know you love her, but you must give me a chance too. I am your wife. I have the right to discipline her." Richard pushed her hand away, his eyes burning with fury. Discipline with scissors? Discipline by humiliating her in front of the neighbors? "Becky, stop making excuses." The air grew heavy. The neighbors stood silent, not daring to move. Linda Green exhaled softly, her gaze falling on Alice. Her eyes filled with both pity and expectation. Richard bent down and kissed his daughter's uneven hair, a whisper of reassurance in that small act. He straightened, fixing his eyes on Becky, his voice low but sharper than any shout. "Tomorrow you will leave this house." The words landed like a hammer blow. Becky froze, her face turning pale, lips trembling without sound. Alice shifted nervously in her father's arms, but for the first time a faint spark of safety flickered in her eyes. Becky clenched the hand, still holding the scissors, her gaze flashing with defiance, as if the story was far from over. Becky froze for a few seconds after hearing Richard say, "Tomorrow you will leave this house." Her eyes widened in confusion, then suddenly filled with tears. Stumbling forward, Becky grabbed Richard's arm, her voice trembling but still trying to sound gentle. "Richard, I love you. I love Alice. I only wanted to teach her to grow up right. I was wrong. Please forgive me." Richard stood still, his face cold as stone. He brushed her hand away without the slightest hesitation. His eyes never left Alice, whose unevenly cut hair brushed against his shoulder. The little girl's eyes were red, still wet with tears, clinging to her father without moving an inch. In his arms, Alice clutched the green dinosaur toy, her breath coming in shaky bursts, as if afraid that even this small sense of safety could be taken from her at any moment. The air in the yard grew heavy, neighbors standing silently at a distance to watch. Just then, Linda Green, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, slender frame, but steady eyes, stepped through the gate. She lived right across the street and had witnessed troubling things in this household many times. Linda looked straight at Richard, her voice low, a little shaky, but clear. "I've seen it many times, Mr. Miller. The child left outside in the yard for hours. I wasn't going to interfere, but today, I cannot stay silent anymore." Becky spun around, her face twisting, a shrill scream bursting out. "You have no right to speak about this. This is our family matter. Stay out of it." Linda did not retreat, her eyes still locked on Richard, ignoring Becky completely. In her gaze was compassion for Alice, and an unspoken message that Richard could no longer turn a blind eye. Richard remained silent. He didn't respond immediately, but a spark of doubt flickered in his eyes, a light he had never noticed before. Alice's tearful words, her terrified look, combined with Linda's testimony, began to piece together a picture he had long avoided facing. Seeing this, Becky quickly changed her tone. Tears streamed down her face, her hands shaking like those of a pitiful soul. "Richard, I've tried so hard. I was the one taking care of her alone whenever you were away for work. I get tired too. Do you think it's easy? I only wanted her to be obedient. That child is not simple at all." Richard frowned, his hand tightening on Alice's shoulder. The little girl lifted her eyes to him, her lips trembling, wanting to say something but lowering her head again, burying her face against his chest. That small body seemed to send out a desperate signal for help, one Richard could no longer ignore. Becky kept manipulating, her voice softening, almost dropping to her knees. "Alice's father, please don't send me away. We are husband and wife. I love this family. I love you, and I love Alice too. I only wanted what's best for her. I was wrong. I promise I'll change." Richard did not answer. He only held his daughter tighter, his eyes drifting into the distance, the echo of Linda's words still ringing in his mind. He suddenly realized all those moments when Alice lowered her head whenever he asked her questions. All those nights she tossed and turned, unable to sleep. None of it was because she was shy, as Becky had once explained, but because of fear. Linda took a small step back, her voice low yet clear, speaking only to Richard. "You need to listen to her, Richard. You are the only one she can rely on." Becky immediately cut in, her tone sharpening, her lips pressed tight. "Be quiet. You don't know anything. You just like destroying other people's families." Richard turned toward Becky, his eyes cold as steel. He didn't need to raise his voice, yet his words cut through the air. "That's enough, Becky. You have nothing left to explain." Becky froze, her lips trembling, then burst into loud sobs, crying as though she were the victim. A few neighbors shook their heads, some turned away and left, but Linda remained, her gaze steady on Richard and Alice. Richard carried Alice back inside the house. The little girl clutched her green dinosaur tightly, her eyes still glancing at Becky with lingering fear. In the living room, Richard set her down on a chair, gently wiped the tears from her face, and asked, his voice softer than ever, "Alice, is there something you want to tell me?" Alice bit her lip, lowering her eyes, staring at her small hands. She hesitated, then whispered so quietly Richard had to lean close to hear. "There's something I want to tell you, but I'm afraid my stepmother will hear." Richard froze, a sharp ache in his chest. He placed his hand on her shoulder and nodded. "I'm listening. Don't worry. No one will hurt you anymore. If you don't feel safe, you can tell me another time. There's no one who will force you." Alice lifted her eyes, tears glistening, her gaze a fragile mixture of hope and hesitation. Richard knew this was only the beginning of the truth. Outside, Becky stood on the doorstep, scissors still in her hand, her eyes burning with rage. The face that moments earlier had pretended to cry was gone, replaced by something darker that was beginning to surface. That night, when the house had already sunk into silence, Richard was still sitting at his desk. The yellow lamp cast its glow across his tense face, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, though nothing came into focus. In his mind, the same images played over and over. His daughter clutching the green dinosaur and sobbing uncontrollably, Becky's shrill screams, and the way Linda Green had looked at him, as if forcing him to wake up after years of numbing himself. He slowly leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. Every strange sign from Alice rushed back like an indictment he had never dared to read carefully. The time she said she did not want to stay home with her stepmother, the moments he noticed small scratches on her arms but chose to believe Becky's careless explanations, the nights she lay with her face to the wall, hugging the brown teddy bear tightly, refusing to answer when he tried to talk to her. All of it stacked into a wall of guilt Richard knew he could no longer deny. He opened the drawer, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and placed the pen neatly on top. His hand trembled slightly, but each stroke of ink appeared firm and decisive. Divorce petition. The next morning, Richard woke up early. Alice was still curled up in bed, the teddy bear resting at the corner of the blanket, the green dinosaur pressed tightly against her chest like a fragile shield. He looked at his daughter for a moment, his eyes softening, then stepped out into the living room. Becky was already sitting at the dining table, dressed perfectly, her face carefully powdered as if nothing had happened. Richard placed the paper on the table and slid it toward her. His voice was low, hoarse, and cold. "Sign it. We end this here." Becky froze for a few seconds, then snatched the paper and skimmed through it. Her face gradually changed color, her hand trembled, then suddenly she hurled the paper violently to the floor. Her voice rose, seething through her clenched teeth. "You'll regret this. I gave up everything for you. Do you think you can just discard me whenever you feel like it?" Her anger twisted the made-up face into a grotesque mask. The gentle image she once wore was gone, replaced by a Becky with blazing eyes, trembling lips, and a shrill, cutting voice that scraped against the air. Alice flinched at the shouting, rushing out of the bedroom. She trembled all over, clutching the green dinosaur, her wide eyes filled with panic. Her gaze drifted toward the corner of the bed, where the brown teddy still lay, as if she wanted to run back and hold onto it too, but her feet stayed glued to the floor. Richard stepped between his daughter and Becky, his voice sharp as a blade. "Enough. You're exposed now, Becky." Becky sneered, the twisted smile stretching across her face. "You think you're so smart, Richard? You think just because you run a big company and have money, you can throw me away like an old rag? I won't walk out of here empty-handed, don't you forget that." Richard did not answer. He quietly picked up the divorce papers from the floor and placed them neatly back on the table. His eyes no longer wavered. Alice hid behind him, her small hand clutching the hem of his suit jacket, each finger trembling. Richard walked toward the door, pulling his phone from his pocket to check. The screen lit up, a security alert clearly displayed, "Unauthorized access detected in the personal system." He frowned, his finger swiping quickly, opening the access log. A series of unusual traces appeared, their timestamps matching the exact days he had been away on business trips. His heart sank. In an instant, every suspicion connected itself. It was not only Alice who had been a victim, even his work, the only thing he believed he had under control, had been violated. On the phone screen, one name appeared clearly: Victor Hale. Victor Hale, 42 years old, the director of a rival tech company, a man who had competed with Richard more than once, using any means necessary. Just seeing that name was enough. Richard understood this was not a matter of a broken relationship. This was betrayal, a scheme laid out long before. He clenched the phone tightly in his hand, his eyes darkening. From the dining room, Becky still stood staring out, a half-smile flickering across her face, as if she knew exactly what he had just discovered. Richard clenched the phone in his hand, the name Victor Hale glowing on the screen like a dagger stabbing straight into his heart. He immediately sat down at his desk, opened the computer, and logged into his private security system. Layer by layer of data unfolded. Dozens of important files had been copied. The traces left behind were undeniable. Someone had accessed his account without authorization, downloaded documents, and sent them out from a device inside his own house. Richard's fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through the strange string of emails. The recipient address was so familiar he could not mistake it: Victor Hale at. The subject line was blunt, the content brief, but more than enough to leave him frozen. "The design data has been taken. All that's needed is confirmation of the payment." Richard closed his eyes, and Becky's image came flooding back. The times she would drop by his office, pretending to bring coffee, asking questions about the child safety project, even laughing as she said she wanted to understand more so she could share more with you. He had once naively believed it was the care of a wife. Now he saw it had all been nothing but a cover for betrayal. A faint sound made him turn around. Alice stood at the doorway, a green dinosaur clutched in her arms, her eyes hesitant. Richard gently called out, "Alice, come here to Daddy." The girl walked slowly forward, sat close beside him, her eyes fixed on the computer screen, though she didn't understand it all. Richard stroked his daughter's uneven hair, his voice softening. "Didn't you have something you wanted to tell Daddy the other day?" Alice hesitated, then whispered, as if afraid Becky might overhear. "Mom, Becky left me outside in the yard many times, even when it was cold. She said I wasn't allowed to bring my brown bear with me. She told me I didn't deserve to hold it. I had to stand alone, I was so scared." Richard's throat tightened. His hand froze on his daughter's shoulder. He turned fully toward her, pulling her into his arms, the green dinosaur caught between them. His voice dropped low, filled with heavy regret. I'm sorry for letting you go through that alone. From now on, no one will ever make you feel afraid again." Alice buried her face in his chest, her small shoulders trembling. Richard closed his eyes, the pain gathering into a storm inside his chest. He made a vow to himself. This time he would not back down. The phone on the desk suddenly rang. Richard startled and picked up. A young woman's voice came through, firm yet full of concern. "Mr. Miller, this is Karen Monroe, Alice's homeroom teacher. I think you need to know something. Lately, Alice has been falling asleep in class several times. I also noticed small bruises on her arm. When I asked, she just gave a forced smile and stayed silent. I couldn't ignore it. That's why I'm calling you." Richard closed his eyes, his hand gripping the phone tightly. His voice turned hoarse. Thank you, Miss Monroe. Thank you for telling me. Karen Monroe was a young teacher, devoted to her students, who had only been at Alice's school for 2 years. Richard had met her just a few times at parent meetings. He clearly remembered her gentle eyes, and he also remembered Alice once saying, "Miss Monroe always pats my head when I do something right." Now, that very voice had become living proof of everything he had chosen not to see. The call ended. Richard set the phone down on the table and sat in silence. Alice looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears yet glowing with expectation. He nodded and softly said, "I believe you, Alice. Everything you've told me, I will listen to." The girl clutched the green dinosaur tighter, then turned her head to glance toward the bedroom, where the brown bear lay still. Richard caught that look and understood that both bears had now become the threads binding his daughter to the past and the present, to the love that was lost and the protection newly found. He turned back to the screen, deciding to restore all the deleted data. Files gradually reappeared, among them another email, Becky's handwriting starkly evident. The content was brief but undeniable. "The data is ready. I want the money this week." Richard felt the blood surge to his temples, his hand clenching until it went pale. Becky had not only betrayed his trust, not only shattered his daughter's spirit, but had also sold out the very work he had built over a lifetime. He stared at the words in the email, his breathing heavy. In his mind, only one question thundered. How far was Becky willing to go, and what would he have to do to stop her? Richard sat upright after recovering the emails. His face darkened. He printed out all the evidence, neatly arranged it in a file folder. The next morning, he drove straight to the Manhattan Police headquarters. A woman stepped out from the investigation office, tall, her black hair tied back, sharp eyes that gave nothing away. The nameplate on her jacket was clear, Detective Maria Santos. She was close to 40, well known in the field for her toughness and integrity. Maria extended her hand, her voice short but firm. "Mr. Miller, I've skimmed your file. Show me the evidence." Richard placed the folder on the table, opening each printed email. His voice grew hoarse. "These are the stolen data from my company's system. They were sent to an address belonging to Victor Hale, and the sender was Becky, my ex-wife." Maria turned each page, her eyes cold, her tone severe. "Mr. Miller, this is no longer just a family matter. This is cybercrime. If this evidence is verified, she and her partner will face federal court." Richard clenched his fists and gave a small nod. He knew from this moment on it was no longer about saving face or protecting a false home. This was a real battle. That afternoon, Richard returned home. Linda Green was already waiting at the gate, her face full of torment. The woman stepped forward, her hand trembling as she held a wool scarf, her voice choked with guilt. "I need to tell you, Richard, I saw it many times. The little girl left outside in the yard for hours, in the cold, and no one let her in. I wanted to call you, but I was afraid of causing trouble. I regret not speaking up sooner." Richard looked at her, his eyes heavy. He gripped Linda's shoulder gently and said softly, "It wasn't your fault, Linda. The only one to blame is me. I was blind, and I let her suffer alone." The door creaked open, and Alice peeked out. She still clutched her green dinosaur, watching Linda with timid eyes. Linda bent down, gave her a kind smile, and whispered, "Don't be afraid anymore. I will stand by you." Alice blinked, then nodded softly. Her small hands clutched the dinosaur tighter. A few days later, at school, Richard met Miss Karen Monroe, Alice's teacher. She was about 30, petite, with neatly tied blonde hair and gentle, bright eyes. Karen spoke as soon as Richard stepped into the classroom. "Mr. Miller, I'm worried about Alice. She has fallen asleep in class several times and I've noticed bruises on her arms." When I asked, Alice just smiled, but her eyes were full of fear. "I know something isn't right, but I can't change it alone. I'm very glad you've decided to step forward." Richard was at a loss for words. He bent down, took his daughter's hand, and whispered as if making a promise. "I've ignored this for too long. I won't let anyone hurt you again, Alice." The little girl looked up, her eyes wet but holding a faint spark of light. In her arms, the green dinosaur and the brown teddy bear were pressed close, like two missing pieces that helped her believe she still had a family. Richard began gathering more testimonies and met with a reputable attorney. Attorney Michael Turner, a man in his early 50s, had years of experience in family and corporate disputes. He sat in thoughtful silence as Richard explained, then tapped his pen lightly on the desk. "Mr. Miller, we have enough grounds to file a lawsuit. The issue is not only about custody, but also about serious criminal behavior. I will support you as much as I can." Richard nodded, his eyes beginning to brighten, as if he had finally found an ally after so many days of feeling lost. That evening, when father and daughter returned home, an anonymous envelope lay neatly at the door. Richard opened it. Inside was a series of photographs of Becky sitting with Victor Hale in a dim cafe, their heads close together, their faces serious as if in deep discussion. His heart pounded, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through each photo. Alice stood beside him, curiously watching her father, but Richard quickly closed the packet and slipped it into his pocket. Under the faint porch light, Richard gripped the envelope tightly. He knew this battle could no longer be avoided. Becky and Victor had crossed a line, and he would have to bring everything into the light. The house sank into a heavy silence after the night Richard received the anonymous envelope. He sat for a long time in his study, the yellow light casting shadows across his darkened face. Alice was already asleep in her room, her small arms clutching both the brown bear and the green dinosaur as if they were sacred guardians. Richard knew the storm was not over. What he did not expect was that Becky would return so soon. The next morning, after dropping his daughter off at school and coming back home, a knock echoed at the door. Richard opened it. Becky stood there, not with an angry face, but with reddened eyes, tear-stained cheeks, and a trembling voice. "You threw me out. I have nothing left. How could you, Richard? Think of our marriage. I love you. I love Alice. Don't do this to me." She wore a plain beige dress, her makeup faint, her appearance so sorrowful that any outsider might have believed she was a pitiful wife abandoned. But Richard was no longer the blind man he once was. He stayed silent for a few seconds, then turned and walked into the living room. Becky quickly followed. Richard opened his briefcase, pulled out a stack of photos, and laid them on the table. In the pictures, Becky sat with Victor Hale in a dim cafe, their heads close together, their eyes full of calculation. There was no denying it. He pushed the photos toward her, his voice cold. "You can explain this." Becky looked down, her face drained of color. For a moment, her eyes darkened, but only seconds later, she forced a strained laugh, her voice breaking. "You hired someone to follow me? Richard, do you distrust your own wife this much?" It was just a simple business meeting. Richard's expression did not change. His tone dropped lower, resolute. "Stop lying to me, Becky. I have everything. Even the emails you sent. Even the stolen data." This time, Becky could not laugh. She shot to her feet, her voice sharp and shrill. "You think you've won? You'll lose more than you can imagine. I gave up everything to be with you. You owe me your whole life." Richard slowly stood, fury flickering in his restrained gaze. "You only used me. You wouldn't even spare a child." From inside the house, a door creaked open. Alice trembled as she stepped out, clutching both the brown bear and the green dinosaur, pressing herself into the corner. Her wide eyes filled with fear as she listened to the shouting, but she dared not make a sound. The scene etched itself deeper into her young mind, another scar to carry in silence. Becky turned around, saw Alice, and immediately changed her tone, tears streaming again. "Alice, my daughter, tell your father, I only want what's best for you. I love you." Alice stepped back further, clutching her two teddy bears tightly, shaking her head hard. Richard stepped forward, shielding his daughter. His voice came out like a low growl, not loud but strong enough to stop Becky at once. "Don't you call her your daughter? You lost that right already." The atmosphere fell into a suffocating silence. Becky froze for a few seconds, her eyes blazing with fury. Then she lowered her voice, hissing through clenched teeth. "You will regret this, Richard. You have no idea who you're up against." Richard didn't answer. He only pulled Alice closer into his arms and turned away. Becky stood in the living room, breathing heavily, then stormed out, the sharp sound of her heels striking the tiles like knives cutting into the air. Alice looked up at her father, her lips trembling. "Daddy, I'm scared," She'll come back." Richard bent down, his hand stroking her hair. His voice was softer now, yet firm. "No one will ever hurt you again. I'm here." Just then, the phone rang, shattering the silence. Richard picked it up, his face tense. A voice from the courthouse operator came through. "Mr. Richard Miller, your lawsuit has been received. The first hearing will be scheduled soon. Please be prepared." Richard gripped the phone tightly, his eyes fixed on the window where the pale afternoon light streamed in. He knew the real battle began here. The beep of the ended call echoed, and the room sank back into stillness. Richard turned, seeing Alice still clutching her teddy bears, her eyes watching him with worry. He let out a sigh, but in his gaze burned an unshakable resolve. The call from the court still echoed in his ears, as Richard held Alice closer while the two of them walked through the security gate. Inside, the solemn atmosphere made Alice's breathing grow shorter. She clutched her green dinosaur tightly, the brown teddy bear tucked safely inside her fabric bag. Richard scanned the room for familiar faces, and he saw Linda Green sitting in the back row, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Miss Karen Monroe stood nearby and gave him a small nod. Detective Maria Santos met Richard's eyes with a steady, unwavering look. On the opposite side, Becky adjusted her hair, her makeup carefully applied, her eyes cold as glass. The clerk called the case. Everyone rose. The judge entered, dressed in a black robe, her silver hair neatly arranged, and took her seat. Her voice was clear and calm. "I am Judge Patricia Coleman. Let us begin." Attorney Michael Turner stepped forward to present the summary. He laid down a folder of numbered documents, photographs, and printed emails on the table. Richard placed his hand on Alice's shoulder, a silent reminder that he was there. Becky suddenly cut in, trying to push her words through with a strained voice. "She is lying, Your Honor. She hated me from the beginning. I am the victim. I am being framed." Judge Coleman lifted her eyes, her tone firm. "You will have your chance to speak, but you will not interrupt. Sit down." Becky bit her lip and reluctantly sat. Maria Santos was called to the stand first. She opened the evidence file and presented each detail: the timeline of system access, the chain of emails sent to Victor Hale's address, and the seizure reports from devices inside Richard's home. Her voice was direct, free of emotion. The data was copied on days when Mr. Miller was out of the house. The IP address matches. Photographs confirm that Mrs. Becky Miller met with Victor Hale multiple times. "We have forwarded the cybercrime charges to the district attorney's office." The judge nodded, marking her notes. Linda Green stepped up to the witness stand. She gripped the edge, her voice trembling, yet each word landed with the weight of guilt. "I saw little Alice forced to stand outside in the cold as punishment. There were days she cried until her voice was gone. I regret not speaking up sooner. I am sorry to that child, and I am asking this court to protect her." Miss Monroe followed. She looked at Alice before turning to the microphone. "Alice has fallen asleep in class many times. I noticed small bruises on her arm. When I asked about them, she stayed silent and stared at the floor for a long time. She is a good student, but she is afraid, always trying to please the adults around her. I fear for her safety and her sense of self-worth." The judge listened, then gestured toward Richard. He stood and led Alice forward. The child's hand was icy cold, yet the green dinosaur in her grasp still warmed her small palm. The judge's tone softened. "If you wish, child, you may speak just a little." Alice looked up at Richard, and he nodded. Her voice was small but steady. "All I ever wanted was a mother, but she doesn't love me. She said I don't deserve to hold the brown bear. I'm scared. I'm so scared." That sound silenced the entire courtroom. Becky shot to her feet, bursting into tears, her voice shrill. "She's making this up. She's always causing trouble. I disciplined her for her own good." Two officers stepped forward, signaling for order. Judge Coleman fixed her eyes on Becky, lowering her voice but sharp enough to command the room. "Mrs. Becky Miller, if you interrupt again, I will have you removed." Attorney Turner presented printed emails, along with transfer receipts between Sandra Blake and an account tied to Victor's company. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. The evidence shows not only child abuse, but also complicity in stealing intellectual property. This family court addresses custody and child welfare, but the criminal charges related to technology theft have been handed over to the prosecutor. Becky stared at the stack of documents as if facing a cliff, then turned to Richard, her voice low and venomous. "You will pay for this, Richard." Richard did not answer. He only pulled Alice close to his side. The girl pressed her cheek against his suit sleeve, taking a long breath as if to steady herself. Judge Coleman closed the file, looked at each person in turn, then read her decision. Her voice was measured, like the stroke of a firm pen. The court rules as follows. The divorce between Richard Miller and Becky Miller is granted. Custody and guardianship of Alice Miller are awarded to Richard Miller. A protective order is issued, prohibiting Becky Miller from contacting or approaching Alice without a new court decision. Regarding child abuse, the court acknowledges and refers the case to the appropriate authorities for further action. Regarding the leaked data, the court acknowledges the evidence, and according to Detective Maria Santos's report, the prosecutor's office has already indicted Victor Hale on corresponding charges. Sandra Blake is being prosecuted for her role as an accomplice. Becky Miller forfeits all rights to marital property under the clause of severe breach of obligations. This judgment is effective immediately. A wave of whispers rippled, then died down. Becky thrashed, stepping forward, but was blocked by officers. She broke into sobs, then clenched her teeth, her eyes flaring with spiteful needles. The judge tapped her gavel lightly, restoring silence. Linda wiped her tears. "Miss..." Monroe exhaled in relief. Maria closed her notebook. Richard bent down, touched his forehead to his daughter's, whispering as if his words could mend the torn places in her heart. "It's over now, sweetheart." Alice wrapped her arms around her father's neck, her ragged breathing slowly evening out. She placed the green dinosaur into Richard's hand, then pulled the brown bear from her bag, setting the two side by side on the bench, as though arranging an entire small world back into place. They left the courtroom. The long hallway suddenly felt lighter. Linda stepped forward, took Alice's hand, and said softly, "I'm sorry I was late." Alice shook her head, gave a faint smile, then turned and hugged Miss Monroe quickly. Maria shook Richard's hand firmly, her voice steady. "We'll keep pushing the rest forward." Out on the courthouse steps, the wind brushed against Alice's uneven hair. She looked up, her lips moving, gathering every ounce of courage left in her to ask the fear that had haunted her most. "Dad, if one day she comes back, what will I do?" Richard tightened his grip on her hand, but his answer did not come right away. Deep in his eyes, determination and worry stood side by side, waiting for a promise he knew he would have to keep for the rest of his life. Alice's question still hung in the air as the father and daughter stepped down the courthouse steps. Richard bent down to her eye level, his hand resting gently on her small shoulder. He spoke slowly, as if carving his words into stone. "Daddy will stand in front of you. Even if the whole world turns its back, I will still be here." Alice nodded and clutched the green dinosaur to her chest. Richard opened the car door, waited for her to settle in, then walked around to the driver's seat. The seatbelt clicked softly into place. The ride home was quiet, but not heavy the way it once had been. From the back seat, a corner of the brown bear's ear peeked out of the fabric bag. The next morning, Richard woke earlier than usual. He fumbled with the pan. The smell of butter touched the eggs, bubbling and crackling. He brewed coffee, poured milk, and set 2 plates neatly on the table. Alice padded barefoot into the kitchen, her messy hair trimmed just a little straighter by his careful hands the night before. She stood still for a second, staring at the eggs and toast. "Daddy, you made this yourself?" "I'm learning," Richard said with a shy smile. "Try it for me." Alice took a small bite, then nodded more firmly. "It's good. Can I give half to Brown Bear?" "All right, but the bear only gets to look." Alice covered her mouth, giggling the first full laugh in days. On the way to school, they stopped at an intersection where a new crossing guard had just started her shift. She introduced herself quickly as she waved the children across. "I'm Nora Wells, in charge of this crosswalk in the mornings. Good morning to you both," Richard answered politely, while Alice gave a small greeting. Passing through the gate, Miss Monroe was waiting. She looked at Alice and smiled softly. "You seem better rested today." "Because Daddy made breakfast," Alice said, her eyes bright. Miss Monroe glanced at Richard and nodded, a wordless compliment. Richard said nothing more, but he knew he would keep this habit. That afternoon they bought a few colored pencils at a small shop. The shopkeeper, an old man named Raymond Clark, added a sheet of thick drawing paper. "For the little lady. Draw something you want to keep." Alice hugged the paper to her chest, whispering her thanks. In the car ride home, she murmured, "I want to draw my bedroom window, with 2 friends keeping watch." Richard immediately understood who those friends were. That evening, father and daughter sat at the cleared dining table. Alice placed the brown bear and green dinosaur on the surface, like guards at their post. Richard opened the short story collection he had once left unfinished. He read slowly, pausing at just the right places to breathe. Alice listened, blinking evenly, her free hand playing with the bear's ear. When the book finally closed, she lifted her face to him and asked in a voice very small but very clear, "Do you miss Mom?" The question struck the very place Richard had been avoiding. He looked into her eyes and saw his own reflection there. He chose honesty. "Yes, but your mother would be happy that we still have each other, because you're growing up the way you want to, not in fear." Alice stayed silent for a moment, then nodded, as if swallowing her answer into her chest. She pulled out a box of new pencils, took out a small sharpener, and sat quietly shaving each tip. A faint scent of wood rose in the air. Richard watched, his heart softened by such ordinary sounds. Alice set the sharpener down, looked at the 2 stuffed bears, then turned to her father. "Daddy." "Yeah, I have something." She reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small pair of school scissors. The blades glimmered faintly under the lamp. Her hand trembled slightly, but her eyes did not. "I'm not afraid anymore. I trust you." Richard froze for a moment. Everything that had happened outside in the yard felt like a short film being torn away, leaving only the little girl sliding the scissors across the table toward him. He placed his hand on the table, not rushing to take them. "Are you sure?" Alice nodded. "I want you to keep them, so if anyone ever uses scissors the wrong way, you'll tell them to stop." Richard swallowed hard, his throat burning. He reached out, his palm open as if to catch a promise. The scissors rested there, strangely light, but inside his chest, they weighed as heavy as a vow. Late at night, Alice spread out her drawing paper. She drew a window frame, and on the sill sat the brown bear next to the green dinosaur. Below them was a large hand holding a small hand. She colored slowly, carefully, as if afraid to break the rhythm she had just found. Richard sat across from her, fixing the labels on her books, adding a little strip of tape to the corner of her pencil box. Every gesture carried a reason, and every reason carried love. Before going to bed, Alice placed the 2 stuffed animals side by side on the shelf, turning their heads toward the bed. She climbed under the blanket and stretched up to hug her father's neck tightly. "Daddy, tell me one more story." "Tomorrow I'll tell you 2. "That's fine." The muffled laugh in her throat made Richard feel the house grow warmer by another degree. He pulled the blanket up, turned off the bedside lamp, and left a thin line of light glowing from the hallway. When the door closed most of the way, Richard finally opened his hand and looked again at the scissors. The fading tremor of his knuckles was still imprinted there. His heart pounded in his chest, and his eyes grew wet, for no reason other than the fact that his daughter had trusted him one step further. He placed the scissors in the drawer beside her bed, right next to the small hair clip Alice loved so much, as if placing a promise where it would be easiest to see. Richard's hand slid the drawer shut. He stood still by the edge of the bed, listening to Alice's steady breathing, then looked up at the shelf where the brown bear and green dinosaur sat, keeping watch. In the dim golden light, the scissors lay quietly like a new oath, and his eyes glistened, refusing to dry completely. Alice shifted in her sleep, eyes half open, her small hand reaching out. Richard bent down and pulled the blanket up to her chest. When she touched the sleeve of his shirt, she clutched it, her broken whisper spilling out as though she had just escaped an old dream. "Dad, you're here, right?" "I'm here," he answered, sitting down by the bed and wrapping his arm around her thin shoulders. She immediately nestled against him, her whole body relaxing as if she had just dropped a sack of stones from her chest. Richard held Alice tightly. No one can ever make you cry again. I swear." The next morning, he rose early once more. This time he was no longer clumsy like on the first day. The eggs came out just right, the bread toasted golden on the edges. Alice pulled out a chair and placed 2 stuffed animals on the table. The brown bear sat closest to her. The green dinosaur tilted its head as if guarding the door. She ate slowly, her eyes glancing up at her father from time to time. "Do you have an appointment with anyone this morning, Dad?" "Yes. Miss Monroe recommended a child psychologist. I want you to try meeting her once. If you don't like it, we'll stop." Alice stayed silent for a moment, then nodded. "I'll go, if you wait outside the door." The counseling office was in a building near the school. The one who opened the door was Dr. Hannah Reyes, in her mid-30s, with a warm voice and patient eyes. She gave a brief introduction, then asked if she could speak with Alice alone for 15 minutes, while Richard waited in the lobby. "You can keep the green dinosaur," she told Alice, "and if you want, you can place it wherever you like." Alice looked toward the frosted glass where her father's shadow faintly appeared, then set the dinosaur on the chair next to her, as if to stand guard. The conversation moved slowly, mostly short questions. When she came out, Alice didn't say much. She simply walked straight over and wrapped her arms around her father's waist. "Doctor." Reyes handed Richard a small sheet of paper. "Tonight's assignment," she said. "Write a sentence that makes her feel safe. Keep it short. And place it beside her 2 stuffed friends." That afternoon, Richard pasted the blank sheet onto a piece of cardboard and handed the pen to his daughter. Alice thought for a long while, then wrote each word carefully, pausing between the periods. She placed the cardboard on the shelf, right behind the brown bear and the green dinosaur. "Read it," Richard said softly. Alice shook her head, pulled out a chair, and motioned for him to sit next to her. She waited until he had settled before opening her mouth, her voice small but firm. "I have both Mom and Dad. Mom left me the brown bear. Dad gave me the green one. I will keep them both." Richard looked at her, smiling gently, breathing in deeply, as if to swallow all the light in the room. "From now on, we will write a new story together." The dinner was simple, but they spoke more than usual. Alice talked about painting a picture on the theme of the safe door at school, saying that Miss Monroe praised her for knowing how to place colors in the right spots. Richard told about a business trip when he got lost at night and had to ask a security guard for directions, and both laughed when he described how he had mispronounced the street name. There was no cold metallic sound, no slamming doors, only the soft clink of fork and knife and occasional bursts of laughter. Before bedtime, Richard asked, "Where do you want your 2 friends to sit tonight?" "On the desk, facing the door." "Why?" "So, if anyone does something wrong with scissors, they will see it first." Richard paused for a second, then nodded. He understood it was not just a child's arrangement, but a ritual of self-protection. He placed the 2 stuffed animals on the desk. The brown bear leaned slightly against the green dinosaur, as if resting on its shoulder. Beside them lay the cardboard with Alice's written words. The scissors Richard had locked away in the drawer remained untouched, like a sealed promise. Alice yawned softly. She climbed into bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and turned her head toward the desk. "Dad," she called, her voice lowering. "Yes? I think Mom would like me to keep the brown bear. She didn't like it when I cried." Richard pulled a chair close to the bed, resting one elbow on the side and placing his other hand gently on the blanket. "I don't like it either, and I'll make sure that doesn't happen anymore." Outside the window, the late afternoon light slowly slipped into the room. It painted a soft golden streak across the wall, past the edge of the shelf, and settled on 2 velvet ears and the corner of the white paper. Alice closed her eyes. Her breathing grew steady. Richard sat still, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall, like the last guard at a gate newly rebuilt. He felt his chest grow lighter, not because everything was solved, but because his daughter had placed another pair of scissors in his hands, the scissors of trust. He stood up, dimmed the lights, leaving only the hallway glow. The room felt as quiet as a small chapel, where every object carried its own meaning. Richard turned back, looked through the window, then at the 2 stuffed animals sitting side by side, one tied to the past, the other opening to the present. Between them was a sentence drying under the sunlight. He bent down, gently touched his forehead to hers. "Sleep well, my girl," Alice answered with a dreamy murmur, her hand unconsciously reaching toward the desk to make sure her friends were still there. When her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, she smiled faintly. Closing in, only the window frame cast the last rays of dusk. Father and daughter sat together, breathing in rhythm, hearts gradually lighter, and in that silence, a question rose like the final period of the day. Could it be that sometimes a child is the one who teaches adults how to begin again? When the scissors were closed by law and conscience, we saw that what seemed the most fragile a child's plea was stronger than all the noise. The story did not end with revenge, but with justice. The wicked were punished, the good were rewarded. The court protected the little girl. The father learned to stand as a shield against the storm, and two stuffed friends, the brown bear from her mother and the green dinosaur from her father, seemed to join past and present so that the heart could be healed. The message here is simple, yet enduring. Love must have discipline. Justice must carry compassion. Do you believe that a single embrace, offered at the right moment, can change an entire life? Which moment touched you most? The words, "Dad, I'm scared," the scissors being set down, or the promise, "Dad swears." Have you ever witnessed a child in need of protection and not known what to do? If you were in that situation, how would you step forward? As the owner of Story 4 Heart, I truly care about you. How are you feeling today? Are you doing okay? Where are you listening from? On your way home? In a quiet room? Or in the middle of a busy day? Remember to eat your meals and get enough rest. If this story touched you, share a line with me. What warmed your heart? What would you like me to tell next in this series of heartwarming stories, touching stories? Leave a comment, share your experience, and if you know of a story that needs to be heard, send it to Story 4 Heart. Here, we believe in hand holding hand, and we believe that every person has the right to put the scissors down, to begin again, gently yet resolutely.